It's all good. How do I pronounce your name as well?
Bohdan. Yeah, lots of foreigners, they kind of stress, I imagine, the first part of the word, and they go for Bohdan, and honestly, I don't even know. I'm not myself even aware which the right stress of the word is, but whatever that might be, Bohdan is okay. Listen, that's a big privilege for me. That's a big honor. I was not expecting you to reply. So thank you very much for deciding to join the podcast. Again, a big thing for me personally, despite the fact that I've been into antinatalism a fairly short time. It still appeals to me. And, it's one of those cases when you try to look at a certain moral belief and philosophical view, it appears to be perhaps almost or completely undisputable. Would you say so? Would you say that in terms of debating it, it's nearly impossible to contradict it anyhow?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, if you mean, are there arguments against antinatalism that someone else could reasonably find convincing if they're coming from another worldview, then there are. There are other people who, if someone is religious, right, there are religious arguments for antinatalism, but depending on the religion, you can also have religious arguments against antinatalism. Now, I'm not religious, I'm an atheist, so I would just fundamentally disagree with their worldview, but that's kind of a separate point, Again, you can also kind of, even from if you sort of remove religion from the question, you can also, if you take like a negative utilitarian, right? So they might not reach an antinatalist conclusion because they may think for some reason that, bringing a child into the world is somehow going to reduce suffering overall. Or you might be a classical utilitarian and say that, well, on the condition that a child is going to have an overall a net good life, then within their worldview, you can see an argument, at least in theory, against antinatalism.
Yeah.
But I would say, if we're talking about in practice, given the state of the world, and any reasonable assessment of what a life is going to be that you're bringing into this world, pretty much all worldviews are probably going to be hard pressed to argue against it, I would say.
Which, to my understanding, this argument, kind of counter-argument to antinatalism, ties into this almost ongoing and never-ending debate between good versus bad, and good not being able to exist without bad. I think that's a big part of counter-arguments. I'm pretty sure you've lots of times been told that for no bad, there wouldn't be any good. But, let's kind of cap it for a second. There will be a place. We'll reach that shortly. I'd like to start on a bit of a perhaps distracted note of the reality of running a YouTube channel of Antinatalist. When I first ran into your channel, I must confess of being guilty not subscribing immediately. So I had been watching, and I believe it's not the first case, right? I think you might be aware of the statistics how's it going with the statistic of subscribers versus non-subscribers. How's it going?
I actually don't know right now. I haven't checked that for a while. And actually, it's been so long since I checked it that I can't remember. I try not to get too bogged down in the statistics, because I feel like I can do that because I don't rely on YouTube for an income. And also, I just enjoy doing it, right? So I feel like I haven't got the pressure of like checking it for financial reasons, and also I just enjoy doing it. So I feel less of a pressure to be checking up on these on the sort of analytics on the back end. So sense. It's actually been quite a while since I've checked that.
I think being distracted and sort of removed from the numbers alleviates certain pressure and stress, because it's a tough game to play. Whoever tells you that run YouTube can lead you to immediate income is slightly wrong, to say the least, I believe, right?
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like there are certain analytics I'll check, but yeah, stuff like that I don't tend to check it regularly.
In terms of numbers, when I did subscribe finally, which was a greatest, although not the fastest decision, apparently, I was slightly distraught and perhaps bemused for the numbers of subscribers, because considering the numbers that you get under some of those videos and the exposure, probably the numbers of subscribers is not very correlated to numbers of views. So I'd like to tap into a little bit on why you think that is. Is there anything to do with perhaps people being repugnant, a little bit resistant towards a content that kind of can hurt their ego sometimes? How do you land into any conclusion of why videos get lots of views and in terms of subscriptions, some people might be a bit resistant?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I have the number of subscribers I do, which is about 6,500 at the moment, is going to be for all sorts of factors, right? So, some of it is going to be like you said, someone may come across this topic and come across my content, because I'm one of the few people that's sort of regularly making content on this issue. And they may feel some sort of emotional discomfort around the issue because of what it could mean for their actions, right? And so they tend to disengage with it, or maybe they engage, but they don't want to show sort of implicit support in some way or whatever by subscribing. That, I'm sure that's part of it, but I don't want to, put too much emphasis on that, because it, that's going to absolve me of having any responsibility. Part of it will also be the way I'm making my videos. Am I making them in such a way where people want to subscribe? Or it may just be that this is a topic that, most people just don't find interesting. It's most people are not intensely interested in ethics, the average person. Obviously, your philosophically minded people will be more interested, but then who knows how many... Do you explain
those people who are not quite inclined towards contemplation of this sort? Like if you think, or perhaps you've had experience asking a person directly, why haven't you ever thought of this specific issue? How do you explain the mindset of those negligent, in a way, people?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I mean, I very much used to be one of those people up until I was about 20 years old, where I really didn't sort of contemplate these ideas, or really contemplate much generally, to be honest. And it's been quite a while since then. So obviously, honestly, I'm not sure. I think there's maybe some sort of comfort in having a sort of smaller purview in what you consider to be part of your world, if you expect, maybe this is why, we often, if you're constantly watching the news and global news and everything that's going on, it can be very overwhelming, right? And so maybe sort of shrinking our world and the things we consider is something that some people find sort of
almost like taking care of themselves, right?
Yeah, maybe, but I also don't want to push that too far, because there are also many people who get a lot of enjoyment from exploring stuff and keeping up with what's going on around the world. So yeah, honestly, I don't know. Yeah,
quite
maybe
an interesting
it's something
topic for sure. That also, I've prepared lots of speculative topics for the later part of the podcast, but that which we are discussing right now, it's also partially the topic of if something finds us, or if we find there's something, so it's again a debatable and an interesting topic of whether you have found something that had already been in you, and if that's the case, then how it had been in you before, through which mechanism and how it managed to reach you, and why it didn't manage to reach others.
Yeah, exactly. it's probably the case that most people who hear about antinatalism and are convinced by it probably had a general sort of I don't know if this is the right term to use, but predilection towards it anyway. You know,
which they often
sort of
didn't choose.
That way inclined.
Would you say?
Say that again.
Yeah,
sorry?
Which often they didn't choose. Would you say so? Which has been kind of almost imposed or given on them to them.
Yeah, or just naturally sort of grown as a result of their upbringing and their environment around them and the people that maybe they went to school with or the TV shows they watched. All of these sorts of influences will shape the things that we're interested in and what we're more inclined to believe and disbelieve and stuff like that. So, I mean, that, like, you know, I don't want to talk down the arguments at all. There are people who are convinced by the arguments, and maybe then they're sort of the emotional side of their life follows that. But I think for a lot of people, they're already sympathetic to one side, even if they don't really know it. Subconsciously they are. And then it just takes exposing them to antinatalism, and it sort of solidifies something that was already sort of somewhere within them.
It reminds me of something that Alex O'Connor has said recently. If you've been following some of his channel, you've heard of him, I reckon, right?
Yeah. No, I've heard of him, and I sort of watched some of his content, but I don't know if I'm going to know what you're specifically.
Yeah, so lately he said, when he was talking about how to properly go about choosing your favorite philosophy or philosophers, he said it's better to start with someone you've already heard of. Right. Yeah,
I did hear that.
Yeah, so I think partially similar could be applied to people who do find themselves eventually ending up in antinatalism circles, right? Something must have been there before, you know, some kind of inclination to rumination almost, you know, contemplation and treating life taking a slightly different approach to what's been conventional, you know? Yeah. Yeah, so when talking to people, when debating people, are you able to perhaps instantly spot where people's ego gets in the way and how they start treating the topic personally other than objectively, while talking to parents that have already been parents, you know, fathers and mothers? Are you able to spot that precise moment when you look at the person and you say, yeah, well, you're defending yourself at this point?
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes it's very apparent because you will sort of pick up on, you know, an emotional tone in someone's voice, or a certain face they pull, or something like that, or the fact that they just dismiss you. So if someone just simply dismisses you without trying to really meaningfully engage with your arguments, or at least understand why you think what you think, that's probably a result of some form of ego coming up, or defensiveness. There was a group of us that did some outreach in London fairly recently, and there was one guy who, you know, you get people who talk to you but end up disagreeing, like, you know, that's fine. But there was this guy who came up to us and just started, you know, calling us idiots, swearing at us, stuff like this. And it's like, okay, whatever, you know, if this, you know, whatever, you know, this guy is worse for it. But yeah, you'll get obvious cases like that, but then there will be more subtle cases where someone already had, we all have our inherent biases, right? So this isn't just these people, but someone will have a sort of stronger than average bias against adopting antinatalism or even hearing it. And that can just manifest in their willingness to accept the conclusion of something they maybe already, you know, they maybe already agree with certain aspects of antinatalist argument, but they're not willing to admit that, or they're not willing to accept where that leads. So, for example, you know, two of the antinatalist arguments are, one is the consent argument, and generally people tend to, you know, value consent quite highly when it comes to moral issues. The other one is obviously imposing risks on others, quite significant risks as well. That also tends to be something that people will generally sort of view as immoral. But when you apply it to procreation, they don't tend to follow you with where that logic would take them. So if you have someone that's maybe sort of not walking alongside you to the conclusion, and they're more, they're resistant, and they're maybe just denying it, but not actually giving a specific reason why the logic doesn't lead there. That could also be a result of them being sort of, their ego coming up or their biases coming in, but it's not coming out in an emotional outburst, if you get what I mean. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's very obvious and sometimes it's less obvious, but it still has an influence in the conversation.
If they weren't parents at the moment when they are being exposed to antinatalism, do you believe that lots of your interlocutors and people you've had debates and talks with would genuinely be able to change their stance on childbirth?
I mean, to be honest, obviously, so I'm operating off of a biased sample because the people that I've engaged with are probably going to be the ones that are more willing to engage around antinatalism anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm out in public or something like that, most of the people that see the signs just walk past. Right. So there's already a natural filter there that anyone who is willing enough to come up to us and talk is probably going to be at least more open than the average person, because they will tend to be, you will get the people who come over because they're just outraged, right? But most people who come over are either like just genuinely curious or they are somewhat sympathetic, right? And if they are somewhat sympathetic, obviously they're going to be more open to it. If they're curious, it suggests they've kind of got a mind where at least they might be open to it, right? And so I've lost. What was your original question? I lost where I was
myself. Yeah, if they weren't parents.
Oh yeah, if they weren't parents. Yeah. So yeah, there's already that sort of natural filter of people. So any parents that come over are probably going to be more open to considering antinatalism at least, even though they're a parent. Yeah. So I'm kind of biased, right? Because the parents who were never going to change their mind, which is probably most parents, are never going to come up to us, right? So my experience is actually that there isn't a massive difference between parents and non-parents when talking about whether someone is open to talking about antinatalism. There's obviously antinatalist parents. I don't know if you've ever interacted with any. I've interviewed some on my channel.
I might have seen some of those on your videos when there's like a mother and a daughter, and the mother seems to agree with what you were saying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I've got one of those on my channel. I don't know if it's the same one we're talking about, but I was talking to a pregnant woman and she was with her mother. So yeah, I've spoken to many parents who aren't antinatalist who seem pretty open to it and pretty open. I've spoken to a range of parents that have said like, look, I maybe don't agree with everything you're saying. I kind of understand your points, and actually if I had my time again, I maybe wouldn't have had as many kids or had kids at all. So yeah, again, it's a biased sample that I'm sort of giving my answer based off, but in my experience, the difference actually isn't that massive between parents and non-parents.
What do you make out of that particular example when one lady was pregnant, she was standing next to her mother, and was it the mother that mostly agreed with you, or the daughter? I think it must have been the daughter, the younger one, right?
It was a while ago, and I haven't watched that video back for a while, but I remember them both being fairly open. That's
interesting. So what do you make out of that? Don't you find it counterintuitive, at least?
Yeah, I mean, if I saw those people just walking down the street before they'd seen the signs, right, and someone told me that information about them, this is a mother and daughter, and the daughter is currently pregnant,
and they're open to antinatalism, right?
Yeah, but I wouldn't guess that they would be the types of people 100%. That would be open to antinatalism, right? So just from their profile, I wouldn't think that they would be that type of person.
So do you explain that to yourself anyhow?
It's probably just down to their personality and their general curiosity. It might you know, it might even come down to something like when you're engaging with someone in the street and you're conflict avoidant, you might be a bit of a yes person as well, you know? Like if those, you know, sometimes you'll get some people when you're discussing antinatalism with them and they're quite open to it, but you also get the impression that if you were making the exact opposite argument and you were a pro-natalist, they'd probably be open to that as well.
Maybe
there are some people who tend to be just quite sort of
agreeable, right? Highly agreeable.
Yeah.
You know what, in my opinion, that boils down to, I've been lately thinking a lot about, and not least thanks to the discovery of antinatalism, because so what's been on my mind is this unique and at the same time almost ubiquitous presence of human dichotomy in terms of how often we believe in one thing, but then by our actions totally contradict our beliefs. And I think that example with two women could be a testimony to that. So namely, you know, I don't know if I completely agree or disagree with the notion of absence of free will. I am very inclined to believe that we don't have that. Yet, if you look at lives of those people who firmly believe that free will doesn't exist, they probably still do not embody that by their lifestyle, that free will doesn't exist. Maybe you'll have something to say there. Or another example that I can personally bring is that thinking and contemplating about the sense of life, I've been sort of passively, how would I say it, at the courtship with nihilism. And I'd also like to leave that for the later part of the podcast, you know, which ties into the lack of moral, objective morality and every self-created sense being annihilated at the end by the mere fact of death. Yet somehow I'm still here, you know. And I know your position to that would be that's out of evolutionary drivers and out of evolutionary necessities to survive. And yet I still think that myself and many other people, we might believe something deeply, and by our lives, we just display different behavior. You know what I'm talking about? Is there anything that you believe that you don't embody by your actions?
I'm sure there are. None are particularly coming to mind, but there will be. Perhaps in how, and I'm sure this is the case for most people, to be honest, so I don't think this would be particularly enlightening, but I think there are, you know, we all treat other people in ways sometimes that we don't think are the best ways, right? We're more dismissive than we should be, or we're more reactive than we should be, or our ego comes up, for example. So like, I'm obviously just as liable to that as any other person. And, you know, obviously upon reflection, you'd think that's not how I should behave. That's not how I want to behave. But you do it anyway in the heat of the moment. I'm sure there's other ways as well.
So it's a present element in human rapport almost, right? In human behavior, how we seem to believe in one thing, yet our actions slightly contradict. I think that's what might be the case with people who rationally relate to the stance of antinatalism, yet here they are pregnant, you know, planning the parenthood. Very human-like, would you say?
Yeah. I think antinatalism is maybe a more unusual case than other cases because it's fighting against such a strong sort of biological / cultural urge
arguably
that we have,
the main
right?
one, perhaps somebody would argue, right?
Yeah. I mean, not for everyone in their lives, but for most people, this is one of the most important things they want to be part of their lives is to procreate. You know, some of that is informed by our evolutionary history. Some of it is formed by the culture around us, sort of reaffirming that. But yeah, obviously 4.5 billion years of evolution is really going to hammer it into a species to continue, right? Or all life to continue, because, you know, if we'd evolved not to want to persist, then we wouldn't have persisted.
So no arrogance, right? When it comes to a case of a person who seems to be agreeable yet contradicts, you don't spot and you don't just catch yourself thinking a little bit about the arrogancy that could be spotted in that person.
Arrogance in what way?
well, in the way how their actions do not match up their beliefs, even in being agreeable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I would label that as arrogance. I'd maybe labeled it as a bit of sort of cognitive dissonance or something like that. But I mean, I don't know. I don't take much notice of it anymore because I've just it's so common in human behavior. I've only been actively sort of doing this stuff around antinatalism for maybe 3-ish years or something like that. But for about 7 years, I've been doing animal rights activism, and part of that has been advocacy on the street and engaging, people on the street on the topic of animal rights. And you see people all the time doing that. You'll get people becoming complete yes men or women saying, yeah, I agree with this, we should care about animals, and yet they go home and eat them, right? So it's extremely common behavior in humans, and it's not surprising to me anymore. To the point where I often don't even notice it anymore.
What do you make out of, again, the aforementioned Alex O'Connor's opinion when he famously, you probably have heard of him going vegan and then going back on meat eating. And he said that the reason why potentially vegan movement may not end up working is because it has to be established on a level of authorities, not on individual levels, but on the level of authorities. And I fail to remember the example that he gave. Have you seen that video? He was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know which specific video he made that in, but I know the general point. So I agree and disagree with him. So I agree in that if we want to secure the future for animals that we as animal advocates want to secure, right? Part of that is going to be legal protections. And I think actually most of the gains that we can make for animals will be on a systems level. The world, the changes we want to make for animals are not going to happen, in my estimation, by making each person vegan, for example, right? There's going to be, that's part of the story, but a lot of the story is going to be about changing laws and technological innovation and stuff like this. But having said that, even though I think a real significant part of the change is going to come from a systems level, that doesn't absolve us of our personal responsibility, right? So, you could also say that, the trafficking of people for their use in sexual exploitation, this is going to be something that ultimately is going to need to have laws prohibiting it. But, that doesn't mean that we as individuals shouldn't stop engaging in it as individuals, right? We have certain obligations we have towards others, and one of those is not exploiting them in that way, or the obligations we have to animals, I think at the very least, is not killing them. And we can carry out those responsibilities whilst, the world is moving towards those larger systems changes. So yeah, that's what I would say to Alex. I think it's a valid point to make about systems, but don't let that distract you from your personal obligations.
Because to a lot of people, that counter-argument might appear as a bit negligent, as if their self-responsibility is slightly removed. As long as the authorities do not prescribe to a certain way, why should I? Right? And I think I seem to recall what was the context that he was talking about how in the past, namely, I think he was talking, I might be butchering it, but I think the 80s, when this eco trends were appearing, may not have been the 80s probably, but in the past, how to this day some people, which is perfectly great, how they try their very best to take care of the ecology, not to litter, be really eco-friendly, yet those from the higher classes, higher walks of societies, it's enough to take one jet fly to pollute the hell out of the air, so I think that was the kind of a context that he was referring to. Interesting. So it's a challenging task to talk to somebody who's been running a YouTube channel talking about antinatalism to come up with a question that's not been asked previously. Yet I don't think I don't think I particularly avoided your background story of how you got involved in antinatalism, because I wish to ask it from you personally. So what was the trigger? How did it all come about?
So I was living in Sweden at the time, and I'd just recently become vegan. So I was at an animal rights demonstration and overheard a conversation about antinatalism, although I didn't hear them use the word. And then I was speaking to a guy who knew one of the people who was involved in this conversation. And I asked him about it, and he said, don't pay much attention to that. That guy over there, he's just an antinatalist.
Oh, wow, sounded offensive, right?
Yeah, and I didn't get to pursue that any at all then and there, but I'd heard the term then. And then a few months later, I was back in London, and after another animal rights demonstration, I was talking to a few people that I already knew, but I wasn't aware that they were antinatalists. And I then just had like a general conversation about antinatalism with them, and they, presented the arguments to me in the way that they sort of, view procreation. And I gave them some of my, pushback and rebuttals, and I, was like impressed with how they handled them. And then they sent me away with some links to interviews of David Benatar, who I'm sure you've come across. So I watched a couple of his interviews, and then,
What was your pushback at that point? Was it something pretty much similar you still faced from your interlocutors?
Honestly, I can't remember. I can't remember that. I mean, that conversation was like 6-7 years ago, something like that. So probably 7 years ago. So I can't remember like the bulk of that conversation at all, really. Yeah, I actually can't even.
Do you remember perhaps being almost shocked to the fact that some people even reviewed the entire idea of extending life, continuing life?
I think I was, when I first heard about it, when I overheard that conversation, I think by that time I was like aware that this was a thing that some people thought, because I'd heard about it from that conversation. So when I got to the point when I was having that next conversation with the three guys, I think then I was more just curious. I wasn't like shocked or anything like that. I was more just curious. Yeah.
Do you know lots of people who landed into this belief as a result of watching the first season of True Detective?
I know there are some people. I know one personally, but I know that there are people who have come to it through that route.
Yeah, you've seen that one.
I actually still haven't. I've been meaning for ages to watch it. This
guy, I keep forgetting his name, the Matthew.
Yeah, Russ Cole.
Yeah, that one. He's like the embodiment probably of that belief. The embodiment of a lot of, honestly, also a lot of dark beliefs. I don't consider antinatalism, namely, very dark belief, but yeah, this guy is like a walking textbook of everything you need to know about life. Pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think he was based
on Benatar, on Ligotti, Thomas Ligotti. Yeah. We are just about to have perhaps the first, not perhaps, I'm pretty sure the first Ukrainian translation of Thomas Ligotti, and the publisher that is organizing that, I've had a podcast with him. He said that the guy himself is barely reachable at all. He seems to be living in the woods, and he seems to receive only like handwritten letters. He's completely cut off from the civilization, and which is quite, I think, appropriate considering his beliefs. But that would be good. Have you read any of his works?
I actually still haven't read Thomas Ligotti's book. Yeah, it's on my reading list, but I've still not got around to it.
So except for Benatar, any other literature, books, authors that stand out to, reassure your belief?
You mean like ones I would recommend?
Ones that have been impressive / interesting for you, that you found somehow correlating with your belief.
Okay. So specifically on antinatalism. Yeah. Okay. I quite like The Last Messiah by Peter Vesselzap.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I'm just trying to think which other ones. Arthur Schopenhauer. and I might just be blanking. But yeah, I think Arthur Schopenhauer very much so. But yeah.
And in terms of something that's away from antinatalism, overall books, fiction, non-fiction authors, perhaps something that has been excellent.
I really enjoyed reading *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. I also enjoyed reading *Humankind* by Rutger Bregman, which I think is actually would be maybe interesting for other pessimists to read, because Rutger Bregman, he takes more of like a positive view of human nature, and argues throughout the book for that case. So I think that would also be quite interesting for other pessimists to read, because I think often you can get to a view and then just read stuff where you sort of you just get your own view regurgitated back to you in different ways. And that can still be valuable and really interesting, because it can lead you to understand it in a deeper way, or discover aspects of it that you didn't understand before, or you'll come across a certain way that someone's put something that sort of makes you understand what you already felt, but in a more sort of concrete way. But it's also good to read stuff where someone is arguing the opposite case.
Do you force yourself to do that sometimes?
Well, it depends what you mean by force, but yeah, I do that sometimes. So when a paper has come out arguing against antinatalism,
it's interesting. I don't know myself why I use the word force, because to me it appears like almost a physical effort, because certain informational and belief bubbles that we find ourselves in seem to be so comforting and familiar and known that it's almost like a physical toil to break them, to live them, and people are not much inclined to find a way out of them.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say, I would be, if a book came out about antinatalism specifically, I would be more inclined to read it than a book about pro-natalism, but it would really depend on the nature of the book. And I do try to read literature that opposes the view, one, because, I often have to for the videos I make, but also just out of interest. I mean, it's not recently anymore, but another book is What We Owe the Future by Will McCaskill. That's not specifically on the topic of antinatalism, but it's part of that book is very pro-natalist. So yeah, when things are published, and there's obviously specific papers, so there'll be papers that maybe argue against some antinatalist argument that has been made, and I'll read that. I've got to say, I don't read every paper that comes out, because I would just be a hermit if that was the case. But yeah, I make an effort to expose myself to the opposite view.
I notice lots of procreation and pro-natalist guys that used to be worshipped in the past are getting more and more humiliated lately, whether that be the case with Jordan Peterson, who's kind of seems to be falling off his pedestal. Elon Musk, not to even mention that guy. Who's that guy who appears on this podcast when they have a lot of chicks and a couple of really radical?
Oh, Andrew Wilson?
That one. Have you seen that recent video when he couldn't open a jar of pickles or something? There was a really embarrassing moment. Yeah, he was trying to somehow humiliate the woman for not being able to do, and then she pushes the jar next to him and he's struggling, he's sweating,
Oh, right. Yeah.
That was really funny. So that guy is very pro-natalist, I would imagine. So what do you think about the fact that people seem to kind of lose their idols? Everybody used to listen to Peterson. Musk used to be this hope for humanity. Having, how many kids does he have? 6 or something from different women?
Oh, much more, I think.
Probably more. Yeah, so what do you make out of the fact that, is that some kind of awakening that we're going through, or is it just part of the course?
I'm not sure. I mean, some of those things might be indicative of a certain awakening. So there will be a lot of people that used to follow Jordan Peterson or used to follow Elon Musk or be favorable, have a favorable opinion of them when that has changed. Whether that's got anything to do with antinatalism specifically, I'm not sure. I think it's more political. So Jordan Peterson, I think he's sort of, he's maybe driven more people who were more sort of left-leaning and centrists in politics, but maybe were sort of favorable towards the message that he was trying to put out about, basically just trying to, as he puts it, clean up your room.
Attend to
this
yourself,
sort of stuff.
first of all.
Yeah, attend to yourself and this sort of personal growth type stuff. But yeah, like you've said, he's kind of got off the deep end in a lot of ways. So I think he's probably left people behind there. Elon Musk, I don't know. I don't really know how much I need to say on that, but we've all seen what's happened recently with him stepping back. So I think it's kind of obvious that
he's walking in a very unnatural way. Whatever the result of that might be, I don't know, but he seems to be walking like a broken NPC. And I think there are certain, things that involved in that, whatever he might be on. But it's just funny. It's just funny.
But yeah, I don't think that the sort of falling out of favor of those two people in some ways, those two people specifically, I'm not sure is indicative of a swing towards antinatalism. I think the pro-natalists who would have followed those two people have probably just, either they've kept following them or maybe they're just following other pro-natalists. I mean, Jordan Peterson wasn't even particularly known for being a pro-natalist. He is one, but that it's not really something he champions like Elon Musk. Elon Musk was much more pushing it.
Peterson, I clearly recall once being challenged or asked a somewhat similar question. He said, if my memory serves, he thought that, well, for all we know, next thing you want to do, just kill yourself or something like that. When he was asked of something similar, a similar question, he said, well, something along the lines that if you want to stop procreation, you might be like second Hitler or something like that. So again, that's a common case for an antinatalist when people confuse refuse and bring in new life with ending the current one. That's a common case.
Yeah, exactly. And, I don't know. Obviously, different people have different opinions of Jordan Peterson, but I wouldn't really expect him to be doing high-level thinking on this topic. However,
this fall-off, you think, could potentially help people awake a little bit more, perhaps become a bit more cognizant of the antinatalism?
I mean, like prominent pro-natalist figures embarrassing themselves and discrediting themselves might lead people to sort of question the other views they hold and whether they really have good reasons for holding them, because they maybe lose credibility as a thinker. I don't know if that is going to have that much of effect. It could for some people, but I don't expect a big uptick in interest around antinatalism as a result of
because it's fleeting. It came rapidly, it went off rapidly, so probably is not going to have a big impact. Do you find conversations between procreation and anti-creation people often almost like a conversation between a pessimist and an optimist, when one side tends to have a slightly, I don't know if I should say the word realistic, but slightly, more brutal stance on life, whereas the other person is almost inherently incapable of seeing the bad sides of life or diminishes the bad sides of life. Is there a big element of optimism versus pessimism in your conversations with people?
That's sometimes the case, but I wouldn't say that's always the case. I would say when it comes to pro-natalists that I've seen, and actually Jordan Peterson is an example of this, or pro-natalists that I've engaged with, they tend to more be of the opinion that they recognize that there's a lot of suffering in life and a lot of hardship in life, but they just think that that's fine to impose on someone because they appeal to, God, or I had a conversation with a pastor recently who appealed to, even though there's a lot of hardship in life, creating someone they can then go on to experience virtue and be a virtuous person. People can. There was a father that I had a discussion with who sort of appealed to Viktor Frankl and was saying, there's deep suffering in life, but you can sort of drive yourself forward with a sense of meaning, and meaning is sort of the ultimate thing that we should value. So, yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily always a sort of difference between an optimist and a pessimist in our assessment of the sort of quality of life. But I think that's sometimes the case, but it's also sometimes the case that people will maybe agree with a lot of what antinatalists are saying in terms of the quality of our lives, but they think that it's justified to impose on someone because they appeal to some higher good.
Those things that have been mentioned by the pastor that I watched your appearance on, and the father which you mentioned, what your rebuttal of those things is that ultimately they all matter once you are here, right? For a person that's not here yet, it's not even worth of taking the chance, right? Not even worth of playing the roulette.
Yeah, exactly. So if you take the example of meaning, right? So obviously, yeah, once you're here, it's very good to have a source of meaning. After all, we are meaning seekers, as we've been called. But it makes no sense to me to create a meaning seeker, though, so they can go out and then try and gain meaning.
Yeah, that, when I was initially thinking and considering with the help of ChatGPT, when I was just exposed to that, because I thought it would be a great idea to use my own computer, built in me, other than referring to AI. I thought for a second I had this highly irrational and slightly scary thought. What if children actually do choose us? What if children are some sort of out of bodies, entities, which you could call a soul or something like that. And by not picking them somehow, by not bringing them in here, we make a horrible mistake, but I'm aware of the fact that it's a rather esoteric belief that's not grounded in anything. And sometimes, just like in case with God, people often almost manipulate this argument that God wants us to find him, God gives us everything, but then based on what's given right now, because what's the other reality? We can't operate off of right? Off of any condition, right? So, but it was just a slightly scary thought. Like if I decide to go full mode antinatalist, and what if there's some kind of, has a thought like that crossed your mind that what if I'm committing a mistake? What if I'm making a mistake? What if I just haven't studied enough esoteric, researches and whatever that might be, or religious? What if there's one particular school of thought that would explain everything, although not fully scientifically grounded and reasonable? But what if that's the way, and by me refusing to procreate, I'm committing a huge mistake? Maybe thoughts like that appeared in your first years.
I wouldn't say I had that as a sort of genuine concern, but people have presented this to me. What I tend to say to people in response is that, like, unless there's like something that I see as having good evidence behind, I'm not going to let something like that is, as far as I'm concerned, mere speculation, keep me up at night and guide significant decisions in my life, right? If someone wants to present an argument, then they can, and if it's good enough, then I'll reconsider my position. But like, we can't hold ourselves to the standard of having to research and consider every single esoteric belief out there before we come to a conclusion and decide whether we're going to procreate or do some decision in our life. This would just be an impossible standard to hold someone to. I've had this as an atheist as well. Someone will say, well, how can you reject Islam if you haven't read the whole of the Quran and had deep discussions about all of the aspects of the text? And it's like, at the end of the day, there are thousands, if not millions, of religions out there. I can't be expected to consider each of them and give each of them a really decent shake of the stick.
As if all those gods are little tiny gods selfishly expecting humans to get familiar with them, right? That's almost unfair.
Yeah, but it's just like, it's a matter of like, it's a matter of time and the amount of energy you have. And it's just like, yeah, this is just a completely unreasonable expectation to have from someone.
It's somehow a bit of a victimization, almost, like, if that's the word, because I feel like if God is testing us, by checking whether during our lifetimes we end up finding him, then, that puts a certain pressure on me as an individual for perhaps failing him, so there's this level of feeling guilty, the guilt. But again, probably some religious people, devoted Christians, they will say that, feeling guilty for not worshiping God is probably the sign that you need to be more active, and you are given the entire life to find Jesus or Buddha or whoever that might be. So the level of guilt, right, as an integral element of religions.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't feel guilt, just because, I don't believe any of it's true. But
there are atheists who are afraid of hell,
Yeah, I mean, if someone doesn't believe that hell is real, but they're sort of scared of the possibility, I have sympathy for them, but at the end of the day, I'm not gonna let that preoccupy my time.
Well, sure, because we are coming off of what's given to us right now and what's known to us right now. Not what's promised, what could be potentially disclosed. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So, if you don't mind touching upon fairly personal matters, since I am talking with an antinatalism, and I don't remember you being, at least not in the videos that I've seen, you being asked about vasectomy. If you're comfortable talking about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have done videos on this the past. Maybe you just haven't seen them. They were a while ago.
Okay, so it's been done.
Yeah. I have a vasectomy. Yeah.
So wow. So tell me about, how you felt before that. Were there at least moments of, lack of assurance, lack of confidence, fear for the future? If you can recollect those precise feelings right in the run-up before the procedure.
So I'd been an antinatalist for a few years before making the decision to get a vasectomy. So it wasn't something that I just rushed. So by the time I decided to get one, I was pretty sure in my belief. So by the time I decided to get one, I didn't really have too many uncertainties in my mind. Obviously, there was the one uncertainty of do I want to risk the small chance of it going wrong or something like that, medically. But in terms of regretting the actual thinking that I might regret the actual procedure, I don't really remember having that significantly. And, in my mind, the way I think about it is if I'd have gotten a vasectomy and ended up being wrong about antinatalism, then I've just screwed myself over. And at the end of the day, I can adopt or, partner with someone who already has a child. But if I didn't get a vasectomy and I was right about antinatalism and something goes wrong and I ended up fathering a child, well, then I fucked myself over and the child over, right? So it was just even with that sort of uncertainty of am I ever going to regret this? The calculus just seemed to work out that it was better to. It was the more responsible thing to get a vasectomy.
Wow. Yeah. That's
but
powerful.
I have not regretted it since. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made.
You feel certain power in cases when your actions support your beliefs, right?
Yeah, I guess there's a feeling of ongoing validation that it was the right thing to do because I don't feel any reason to think that it was a bad decision.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a powerful move. I don't know if these words are applicable. So, sometimes in the moment, almost in the momentum of oscillating between yes or no, between making or not making the decision, I find myself again beforehand anxiously thinking about the future, thinking of whether my future self will regret that. And sometimes I just remind myself that, you know, who knows what kind of person I'll be in the future? There's no way of knowing that. So sometimes it makes a lot of sense to remind ourselves that in the moment, whatever decision we made, if it appeals to be the most right decision of all available, then you should remind your future self that in that moment it was you and it was the right decision, you know? Yeah. So potentially, purely hypothetically, you probably don't see yourself abandoning the current stance in the future, right?
No. Yeah. There are certain things that you become sure enough in a belief that you can make certain commitments that are based off that belief that have lasting impacts, like getting a vasectomy. I'm obviously, you know, like anyone should be, you know, you should remain open about having your mind changed. Right. But a vasectomy is a practical thing, right? Like if you get a vasectomy, it has certain practical benefits, like you don't have to use other forms of contraception, and it's also a fail-safe. And obviously those benefits lure you towards getting one, and at some point, you know, you've just got to say, okay, I'm sure enough that there are benefits that I want out of this, and I'm sure enough in my belief that I'm not going to regret this, and so, you know, you've just got to do it, you know. And this is not just antinatalist. There are many men that make this decision who are natalists or pro-natalists, right? They've just decided they've had enough children, you know. I know several men who generally are older than me, through family, friends, or whoever, who have vasectomies, and they've never even heard of antinatalism. And it's just
these
the fact
are
that,
out of very practical reasons.
Exactly, it's just a practical reason of, like, I've had 2 kids already, I've had 3 kids already, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not going to want another child. You know, could they be wrong about that? Could they end up regretting that and maybe wanting another child, or their marriage ending and them getting with a new person who wants a child, and you know, there's all these possibilities. But at some point, you know, you've got to say, okay, I'm sure enough in whatever the things are I'm considering, and make a decision. Yeah. And it's fine not to get one. No one should be forced to get one. Obviously, it's a personal consideration on practical grounds that can be informed by philosophical views like mine. But if someone doesn't want to get one, then that's their call, and they should just use other forms of contraception.
Yeah. What if somebody doesn't want to get one, yet they are perhaps covertly, secretly inclined to agreeing with antinatalism, like the aforementioned by us woman who seemed to be pregnant yet seemed to also agree? So a potential parent like that, do you think would make eventually a bad parent? You know what I'm saying? So it's like it's nearly impossible to argue with the stance of antinatalism. Yet, by the way, here's another question. I'm kind of jumping from topic to topic. Have you thought about perhaps compromising your So the question is whether you've thought about compromising your antinatalism beliefs as out of the partner's, let's say, necessities. Like if for your current or potential partner, it was a really high priority that you do have baby. Have you thought if you see yourself going back on what you currently believe out of the love between you two?
No, I know of cases where I suspect that to have happened, but I don't see myself doing that.
It would be like betraying yourself, probably.
Yeah, it would just be betraying myself. It would be betraying what I see as the morally right thing to do. I think obviously relationships are very important, but at the end of the day, you know, if your partner is asking you to make that big a sacrifice, then
it's a serious step.
It raises, you know? Yeah, it's a slippery slope. It raises all sorts of things about that person, about the relationship, and etc. So, but no, that would not be something that I'd be willing to sacrifice. If the relationship couldn't work with that, and they wouldn't, I'd be open in this is not something I particularly want to do where I'm right at now, but if it was such a big deal, I'd maybe be open to adoption. But in terms of biological reproduction, no, this would be, you can't sell yourself out in that way on such a big thing.
Yeah, because also the unions, the marriage unions, where a compromise of that magnitude is done by one of the sides, I don't think they are inherently healthy and potentially hold bright future, because it's like, a child is born. I kind of, honestly speaking, I suspect that it might have been the case with my parents, where one of them was, again, my father clearly contradicted lots of his beliefs with his actions. I believe it's hard to tell, but, I feel like my mother was way more into parenting, for also highly selfish reasons, out of peer pressure, out of the age, for lots of reasons. So I always wonder, if I end up being a father, firmly believing in the antinatalism position, would I even be a good father? What if my son, that's the question that I've been wrestling with ever since I exposed myself to this. If my potential kid comes up to me and asks me, honestly, frankly, in the age when they are pretty conscious, so to speak, why am I here? And I've been asking lots of people the questions who have recently had kids, who've been having kids for some years. And, I am yet to hear a good answer, to be honest. So I'm genuinely scared of me being that sort of a father who's been sort of infected with the antinatalism ideas. Do you potentially see parents who agree with antinatalism being remotely good? Or is there this element of guilt in parents, if you think about that? I know we're talking purely hypothetical, but I don't feel like a guilty parent is a healthy parent, and a parent who feels guilty for bringing the child in and agreeing with that has to only lie to the baby, to the kid,
Do you mean, so just so I understand what you're asking, do you mean if a parent was convinced by antinatalism, would that make them a worse parent? Is that what you're asking?
If they ended up being a parent despite their firm belief in antinatalism, perhaps they discovered antinatalism after they became the parent.
Yeah, right. I mean, that is not my intuition, and from my I don't know any research on this, but from my experience of antinatalist parents, I don't think that is the case. Again,
it's not the case that they are worse parents, right? No,
as in, I don't think it makes them worse parents.
Yeah, right.
So, I think obviously, relations are very complicated. So someone who's a parent who becomes an antinatalist, it could make them a worse parent. But from my experience with antinatalist parents, I've not heard anything that would suggest that antinatalism has made any of them worse parents. If anything, my impression is that they perhaps even become better parents, just because they're much more, they're much more considered in how they raise their child, because they're aware of the fact that they've harmed them by bringing them into existence, or they've done something wrong by bringing them into existence. So obviously they didn't know what they were doing at the time. So in a very plausible way, that could inform them being more considered than the average person for future planning and making sure their child has what they need and stuff like that. Obviously, there are many parents that don't do that. The average parent, probably puts at least some time towards forward planning for their child's life. But I wouldn't be surprised if research was conducted on this, that antinatalist parents maybe even put more consideration than the average parent into this sort of stuff, which in my eyes would make them a better parent. I don't know if that is the case, obviously. Research hasn't been done, but my experience of antinatalist parents so far has been very positive. So I've got no reason at all to make me think that it would make someone a worse parent.
Do you think that thing that makes antinatalist parents better than the parents that have not known anything about it is perhaps the subtle element of guilt towards the children?
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of antinatalist parents, so I can't describe what their feelings may be. I'm sure some of them will have an element of guilt, but their feelings might be more accurately captured by another term. I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that one. But there are antinatalist parents out there if you ever want to speak to one.
Yeah, that would be interesting. So once again, briefly to jump back to the vasectomy topic, again, I'm stepping into a personal field, so you can refuse that question anytime. In terms of, let's say, romantic endeavors after that procedure has been done, what have you been noticing? The reciprocation from partners, from people, support, misunderstanding, questions. What kind of reactions have you been seeing?
So I wouldn't say I've particularly had a negative experience. I don't know if you're asking about particular types of people, but I would say, like, out of all the people I know, a lot of them know my views. So
yeah, I was wondering specifically about the relationship element, like the romantic relationship.
Oh, right, like romantic partners. Yeah. No, it's not been an issue. No. I don't have anything particularly significant to say on it because it's just not been an issue.
Right.
Obviously, if you've had a vasectomy and you're not already in a relationship, obviously that's going to close off certain people who are going to be interested in you. And obviously, if you've had a vasectomy, you should be open about that with potential partners. That shouldn't be something you should hide. And there are going to be some people who, upon hearing that you've had a vasectomy, are going to no longer be interested in pursuing anything with you. And that could be very sad for you because you may be interested in them, but that's just the way relationships work. Some people just are not going to work together. So yeah, that's obviously like sort of a general thing about having a vasectomy and how that plays with relationships. But I've not had any particularly negative. It's not really impacted me particularly that I can notice.
Yeah, right. Okay, so are we good to extend the conversation for 20-30 minutes perhaps?
Yeah, no, okay, of course.
Good. Yeah, because
if you just let me, I'm just going to sort out my lighting because the sun is
reminding you of the existence, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this thing which I'd also like to focus the attention a bit, which is often brought in conversations of antinatalism in all the circles, and that's David Banathar's famous kind of equation where suffering almost overrides joy and happiness. So it also boils down to the point where, to put it kind of mildly, happiness is not possible without suffering. Now, I know the typical antinatalism reaction to that would be, it could be considered for already existent organism or sentient beings, right? For somebody that is not here yet, it's irrelevant. That's why we shouldn't even throw them into this equation. Now, for already existent sentient beings, what is the argument that rebuts the statement and the claim that, happiness is impossible without suffering? There's one that I have heard, and maybe you could agree, disagree, maybe you can add something to it. And I think it comes from you, and I think it was you who said that if we potentially portray a reality in which there was no suffering, only different levels of pleasure, then people would be able to receive even higher pleasure, and nobody would volunteer to receive the higher level of pleasure without being hurt physically or mentally. So that's one potential scenario, which, as far as I understand, neglects the necessity and sort of kills the necessity for pain being a factor in our life, right? So it's one hypothetical scenario. Is there anything else that would contribute to it? And maybe if you could a bit more eloquently unpack this specific case, which I've just described rather poorly.
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure which sort of thought experiment you're referring to. It sounds like something that if I said it, I probably repeated from someone like David Pearce. And I can go over something that's fairly similar. So David Pearce talks about, he's an antinatalist, but he believes that it's just, it's just a lost cause to try and get people to stop reproducing. And so he thinks that we should use transhumanist means to essentially abolish suffering and therefore kind of remove the problem that way. One of the thought experiments he uses to try and convey why suffering has this inherently bad quality, I believe it's him that either came up with this or talks about it, is this, imagine that you have a world where it functions completely fine, everything goes as it should do. It just does so without anyone having to experience suffering. So everyone on this planet only experiences, as David Pearce calls it, information-sensitive gradients of bliss, right? And this acts as a sort of incentive mechanism for us in our physiology, and it allows us to go about our lives as we generally would now and do the things we want to do and stuff like that, and society would function. He then asked the question, why would you want to introduce suffering into that world, right? If everything is functioning as it should do without the suffering, what would be the value in introducing suffering? What would be the benefit to that? What value would it bring? And the answer seems to be that there wouldn't be any. It would just be disvalue. It would just cause bad things to happen. And I think he probably says this because, some people, because of the existence that we are in and the way we've evolved to have pain and suffering as part of our internal sort of incentive structure, and also the way that we interface with the world, we are so used to pain and suffering being a way, it's such an integral part of our existence that we find it hard to understand.
We don't know ourselves without it, right?
Exactly. And so I think people, even though suffering is, very bad, for a lot of people, most people will have significant suffering in their life, if not all people. We've maybe become addicted to it in some way. Not in all ways, but in some ways we sort of become attached to it, and maybe even for sentimental reasons. And it feels like an integral part of our existence that if we didn't have it, we would no longer be able to function even. And perhaps that is the case in practice, that given the way that we are evolutionarily wired, perhaps it is the case that if suffering was removed from our experience of the human condition, perhaps we wouldn't be able to function properly, and things wouldn't go well, at least with some level of suffering. But who knows? At the moment, this is still sci-fi. And so David Pearce just uses that thought experiment as a way to sort of disentangle the instrumental value of suffering that is present in our lives now, and also maybe our attachment to suffering, and tries to really hone in on what actual value does it have inherently. So that is maybe a sort of explanation of what I think you were maybe getting at. Another thing I would say, because some people say the only way to experience happiness is to have some form of suffering alongside it, and I think unfortunately that is true.
Well, that's right? Our reality, but we have never had it differently, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I think some people state that fact and perceive it as being a justification for imposing the suffering, right? But I see it as merely just a
excuse.
I just see it as a damning remark to make about our condition, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just the fact that we now exist and we have a certain evolutionary wiring that means that we need to seek out happiness, fulfillment, meaning, this sort of stuff. And yet the only way that we can really meaningfully get it is through suffering, which is something we want to avoid, right? It has this inherent negative quality. That to me just shows the inherently broken nature of life, in that to get the only thing that we really can value in life, which is these positive experiences of meaning and connection, we have to go through the very thing that we want to avoid to get the thing that we want to get. That to me just seems like a completely twisted environment to put someone into, where the deck is stacked against them.
But it's such a ever-present element of culture, of societies, of cinematography, of literature, of music, of everything, right? I mean, it's one of the most classical hero ascendant story, when first he needs to overcome so that later he is gifted, so to speak. And which doesn't necessarily mean that it's, I mean, it kind of is, because as I said, there's just no alternative. We've never had the access to a state of events, so to speak, status quo, where pain is unavailable or optionally available. So everybody who says that that's how it is like it is. But for somebody who's not been born, there's kind of still a choice, no matter how kind of counterintuitive it sounds, but there's still a choice that belongs to us, those who are already here, to not even expose these people, this potential future people, to throw them into something like that. But it's interesting because, this thing, this sort of this difference between pain and suffering, it's really hard to remove ourselves from it, because we've always been here. And it's something that, at least with me, takes a lot of kind of energy and power of my questionable brain to comprehend it completely. Because I think, well, since it's the only way that things work, since it's the only way that's available to us, then there's no alternative. But then I ask myself, but why shouldn't there be any alternative if we're talking about somebody who's not even born? So it's just a crazy thing, to be honest. I guess that's the bottom line of my rambling right now. The pain being a constant element, an ever-present element for the reach of happiness, it's one of the elements of absurdity of life, in my estimation. Do you find life kind of absurd sometimes, considering, when I speak about absurd, I always, and maybe you as a vegan, I suppose, right? You would probably maybe disagree with that, but there are people, I think, I don't know them personally, but I think there are people who can't eat physically, are incapable of going vegan. But again, maybe that's not true because of certain, perhaps innate disorders, conditions that they were born with. And what a absurdity, in my opinion, when they seem to believe firmly, prescribed to the vegan lifestyle movement, really, yet their physical suit, their meat suit, doesn't allow them to do so. Am I wrong? Is there any potential people like that?
Again, I don't know any personally. Yeah. I'm sure there are maybe some very rare conditions out there, and there's maybe a small minority of people that wouldn't be able to naturally avoid animal products. Of course, we're getting to the point now where we have the technology where we could maybe synthesize the nutrients that they needed so they could get it artificially rather than rely on killing animals. But yeah, as like the vast majority of people, as long as you're, at least somewhat intentional about how you eat, most people will be fine being vegan, is my understanding. In terms of your general point about life being absurd and existence being absurd, I agree. I don't know if I have anything particularly enlightening to say on that, but I just think that, the catch-22s that make up our lives and the perverse incentives in our lives and the situations we find ourselves in are just absurd.
What's the antidote, would you personally? Would you say, the meaning of your life? And does that meaning stand against death and this absurdity which we mentioned?
So I don't think there's any ultimate meaning to life. I think we can sort of carve out some meaning personally for ourselves. So the things that I get the most sort of meaning in are my, connections to others. So like my partner or my friends, my pursuit of projects that I enjoy, like YouTube or researching antinatalism and stuff like that. And also trying to help others. So other humans, other animals, through volunteering my time, or again, one way is maybe through the YouTube, or through making donations, or maybe trying to convince other people around to my way of thinking and stuff like this. So I think those sorts of things are how I find meaning in life. I do think to an extent they, guard against the absurdity of existence and the sort of looming nature of death. I don't think, you're always going to be able to completely guard against those things, but I'm in a position where I don't get, significant anxiety about those things or anything like that. I don't, of course I'm aware of my own death, and it's something that, you sort of come into contact with thinking about, especially, talking about the subjects that I talk about. But it isn't something that gives me significant anxiety at the moment. I'm sure that will maybe change when I get older, when I sort of, am probably more close to it coming. In terms of the absurdity of existence, again, I don't really get significant anxiety around that. I think maybe something, if we go back to The Last Messiah that I mentioned before by Peter Vessel-Zapf. So in that, he talks about this sort of harsh, brutal, sort of nature of existence, and how interfacing with it without some form of psychological protection can be very debilitating for our well-being. And he talks about there are certain ways that we learn to cope psychologically. And he explains 4 key ways that we sort of do that, which I won't go over here, but people can read about in his essay.
Is religion being one of them?
Religion, yeah. I mean, that is an example of one of them. So yeah, I would say probably just like most people, I engage in those in all manner of ways. And yeah, I would say, yeah, we all have our coping mechanisms, whether we realize it or not. I have mine, and it helps me enjoy the time that I have here.
Okay, now to move the topic slightly in a different direction. Is Thanos even a villain?
So I got asked this in the conversation with the preacher. Yeah. So I'm not really going to speak about the example of Thanos in the because I don't know all of the story and the lore and stuff like that. So I don't know the exact sort of details of it and stuff.
Well, I think the most important drive.
Yeah. I mean, I think thinking about the first thing to say is that this is not an antinatalist question, obviously, because antinatalism pertains to the starting of lives, not the ending of them. But obviously anyone who is concerned about the state of the world, and this doesn't just go for, antinatalists, this, there are many people out there that even I've, engaged with who are not remotely antinatalists, but, they engage these sorts of thought experiments, right? I think anyone who is concerned about the state of the world, is going to potentially feel some sort of lure towards discussing these sorts of thought experiments. But I don't see them as entirely useful. One, because they are hypothetical in the extreme. And I think hypotheticals can be useful when they have some sort of relevance to actual reality and will maybe then go on to inform how you deal with real life situations. But this sort of thought experiment is so far removed from reality that I don't actually think it really has much use discussing it. Which I've made some videos on in the past, which I'm happy to share with you, and you can either watch or link them in the description or whatever. So when you say that it has no
practical application in life, you mean that just snapping your fingers, removing the entire population or half of it is practically impossible? Because, you know, genocides are unfortunately keep happening. It's one of the, in quotes, beauties of life. So you say that it's not practically applicable here because genocides, when they do happen, they happen not painlessly, not instantly, you know, and generally, you know, there's no way to escape suffering and this messy state and conditions, right? But is that the point why talking about genocide in case of Thanos is not practically applicable?
Yeah, so I don't know if what Thanos did would technically have been genocide, but it would have been mass killing. And yeah, the thought experiment as presented, like if it was applied to any real life case, for it to be able to apply to a real life case, it would then become meaningfully different. And so you wouldn't actually be talking about the thought experiment anymore. You know, it wouldn't be instant. It wouldn't be painless.
Yeah, right.
Usually, yeah, you would not be doing it on that sort of scale. So yeah, that's why I think, like, regardless of whether someone would or would not choose to do that, the actual discussion around it just isn't really useful. And I think it encourages a shift towards more extremist dialogue that isn't helpful. And it actually distracts from conversations around what people actually have control over. Like, no one has control over whether we go extinct or something like that, but everyone has control over whether they procreate, right?
So what would be your reply to that guy from a video of yours? And I don't know if he's anyhow linked to you, who was very proudly standing with a poster in his hands that says genocide is good or something like that. A very loud, very mouthy guy, if you can recall that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that interview. I forget exactly how we... Yeah, I forget the exact contents of the interview. If there was a specific bit...
Yeah, no, I vaguely remember that. But that guy, he attracted my attention because he made me think. You know, I stopped for a second. I thought, well, apparently genocides, the way we know them, are horrible. You know, even if you die, you know, it will... And perhaps you are lucky to die quickly and painlessly, people that love you will inevitably suffer, right? That's at least probably the minimum reason why genocides are bad. But then I thought, well, what about the Thanos example? What if it's a snap of fingers and everybody's gone? And I'm aware that the train of my thoughts were perilously going into a bad direction, but it just made me philosophically contemplate it. You know, what's your vision of that question that was posed by the guy from video? How do you kind of go about it and wrestle with his question?
You mean the question
that genocide is not bad, you know?
You mean, do you mean in terms of like, in terms of what Thanos did, or you mean in terms of real life genocides?
Yeah, what Thanos did, definitely. Because what I don't really know what was meant by the genocide from the mouth of the guy from the video, right?
Right.
Because I vaguely remember that. But, you know, what Thanos did was kind of, at least what he was portrayed doing, was kind of philosophically deep and interesting. It's actually one of the reasons why I don't like when people shit on these Marvel films, because perhaps in the past they were just all action and no brains. Right now, it's really difficult, at least for me, because not only is the picture amazing, you know, you gotta also use your brain to understand all the references and things. So yeah, in case where it's quick, painless, you know, how would you object to it?
So obviously when it comes to like real life forms of genocide, obviously all of those are wrong. When it comes to Thanos, if someone has the capability of doing something like that, of ending everything instantly, painlessly, like I said before, like I don't think this particularly has any bearing on reality, but if you're talking about this complete hypothetical, I still don't even know, like this would be the most significant action anyone is able to do ever. And I understand why people who care about the state of the world are attracted to stuff like that, because it's a sort of easy psychological twitch they may have of like, oh, well, this is a way that everything could end instantly and it would all be over. But it's like, we've got to bring ourselves back down to reality and realize this isn't a real thing. But if just dealing with the hypothetical, there are so many things to consider that I'm not even sure that I would be actually equipped to be able to make a judgment
so you're
on
saying that. You're not able of perceiving all the potential.
Yeah, like I completely understand that there's so much suffering in the world, and I understand the motivations that people have to stop that. But when it comes to a hypothetical like this, like, it's so wild and it's so out there, and there are so many things you've got to consider that I, as one lone individual, you know, imperfect human, I cannot make a judgment call like that. Like, this is just something that is...
Have you thought about this from the point of view of antinatalism? Because apparently having no population would also mean no continuation, no creation. Wouldn't you think that contribute positively to removing also the suffering?
Yeah, of course. Ending all life would end all suffering, but this is different from antinatalism, right? So antinatalism... Sure. There's kind of two differences here. So the first is that antinatalism is about the creation of lives, but also antinatalism is not an all-encompassing ideology that wants to end suffering, right? That would be something like negative utilitarianism. Now, someone can be a negative utilitarian and an antinatalist, but antinatalism itself isn't necessarily about ending suffering. It's saying that it's morally wrong to impose serious harms on someone through procreating, or it can be about the care for, you know, a lack of consent or the risks imposed on someone. But yeah, it's these hypotheticals that are sort of grandiose in nature and about ending the world. They can have an allure and an attraction to people who want to end suffering. But this is very different from antinatalism in several meaningful ways.
Right. I don't know. I've just had this perhaps either highly genius and brilliant idea, or maybe the dumbest idea that's ever visited me, that perhaps the reason why Thanos could be considered a villain is because and it's very counterintuitive, and perhaps I'm going to receive a lot of hatred for this take, but maybe if he had not erased 0.5% of population, he wouldn't have been considered so bad. Meaning, you know, he removed half of the population, and the rest of the people, they felt immense pain and suffering and loss because they lost somebody, you know. So perhaps that's at least one reason why he may not be easily considered a villain. No, sorry, let me take that back. So he removed, you see, I'm stumbling upon my own thoughts. So he removed half of the population, and the rest of the people, they felt pain because of that. So that's what makes him bad. That's what makes him a villain. Yet if he had removed everybody, there wouldn't be anybody to receive pain, you know. And there's nothing namely to comment here on, but, you know, it's just interesting. It's really interesting. It kind of brings me into this thought how this kind of philosophical questions appear sometimes as almost a byproduct of evolution. Have you ever thought about philosophy as something that we are not even supposed to wrestle in our mind with? Because is there really a purpose of more conceptualizing ourselves? Is there even a purpose of becoming more and more aware? You know, I understand that since we do that, that can't but be a part of evolution, because whatever we do is kind of, you know, with a few exceptions, appears to be natural. But do you find philosophy sometimes almost like a sidetrack from our primitive and natural instincts and forces?
So,
goddamn, I don't know if I understood myself. Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, I can answer it the best I can. I'm obviously no expert in this field, so I don't entirely know. But I would imagine that, you know, when we were in the environment that we evolved in, and we, you know, didn't have this global interconnected society, and we weren't practicing agriculture and things like this, I'm not sure we would have spent a lot of time philosophizing. So in that way, you know, it's something that we've sort of come up with. It's obviously something we are capable of doing with the cognitive capacity we have, because we do it. whether it's something that was selected for evolutionarily for us to be doing. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just our capacity to do this is a byproduct of something that was selected for. But yeah, that's the best I can do.
And if it's the second case, it's pretty peculiar topic of where it could take us. You know, like, have you ever thought about the potential future of philosophical thought as it is? What kind of conclusion we might be able to reach? Do you think the trends are rather promising and positive if you generalize about the future of philosophy?
I don't know. It depends what you mean by positive. Like, you know,
because one would argue that knowing more about yourself it can't be bad, but sometimes some conclusions might be scary, you know.
Yeah, I mean, knowing about oneself is not necessarily philosophy. That can be more introspection or, you know, meditation, things like this. In terms of like the future of philosophical thought, I mean, I have no idea how it's going to go, because you've got all sorts of things like a changing political environment that might crack down on certain types of political thought. You know, you've got artificial intelligence. We have no idea how that's going to impact philosophical thought. So yeah, I have no idea on what the future trajectory of philosophy will be. But whatever it is, hopefully it's positive.
Well, that's a very appropriate point to wrap it up for this conversation. I'm endlessly grateful to you, a great speaker, a great podcast guest. Thank you very much for spending this 1.5 hours.
No, thank you for having me on.
Thanks. And